Hello, and welcome to Bedtime Stories for Tiny Microbes. I'm Nicole, and again, we are reading to Bob. Bob requested a change of scenery, and so tonight we're going to be reading from Heidi by Joanna Spyri, and I'm probably butchering the last name. I'm pretty sure I'm probably going to butcher some other names as I read, so please bear with me. I am not a native Swiss German speaker, but I will do my best. Part 1. Heidi's Years of Learning and Travel. Chapter 1. The Alm Uncle. From the pleasantly situated old town of Mayenfeld, a footpath leads up through shady green meadows to the foot of the mountains, which, as they gaze down on the valley, present a solemn and a majestic picture. Anyone who follows it will soon catch the keen fragrance of grassy pasture lands, for the footpath goes up straight and steep to the Alps. One bright, sunny June morning, a tall, sturdy-looking girl, evidently a native of the mountains, was climbing this narrow path. She led by the hand a little maiden, whose cheeks glowed as if a ruddy flame were under her dark brown skin. And what wonder? In spite of the hot June sun, the child was bundled up as if for protection against the sharpest cold. She could not have been 5 years old, but it was impossible to tell anything about her natural figure, for she wore 2 or 3 dresses, one over the other, and a big red cotton scarf around her neck. Her feet were lost in heavy hobnailed shoes, and the little thing was quite formless as she made her hot and laborious way up the mountain. At the end of an hour of steady climbing, the 2 girls came to the group of houses that lies halfway up the Alm Mountain and is called Dorfli, or the little village. Here they were greeted from almost every cottage, and by everyone in the street, for the older of the 2 girls had reached her home. Nevertheless, she made no pause, but hurried on, answering all questions and greetings as she went. At the very end of the hamlet, as she was passing the last of the scattered cottages, a voice from the doorway cried, "Wait a moment, Deet. I'll go with you if you are bound up the mountain." The girl addressed stopped. Immediately the child withdrew her hand and sat down on the ground. "Are you tired, Heidi?" asked her companion. "No, I am hot," replied the little girl. "Well, we are almost there," said her companion encouragingly. "You must put out all the strength you have for a little while longer. It won't take us more than an hour." Just then, a large, pleasant-looking woman came out of the cottage and joined them. The little girl jumped to her feet and followed the 2 women, who had instantly fallen into a lively conversation regarding all the inhabitants of the village and of the neighborhood. "But really, Deet, where are you taking the child?" asked the newcomer. "It is your sister's little girl, isn't it? The orphan?" "Yes, it is," replied the other. "I am taking her up to her grandfather. She will have to stay there." "What? The little girl is going to live with the Alm Uncle? You must have lost your senses, Deet. How can you think of doing such a thing? The old man will send you back with such a scheme as that." "He can't do it. He is her grandfather, and it is time for him to look out for her. I have had her till now, and I must tell you, Barbel, that I could not think of letting her hinder me from taking such a place as I have just had offered me. Her grandfather must do his part now." "That's very well, if he were like other men," urged Barbel with some indignation. "But you know what he is. What will he do with a child, especially with such a young one? He won't hear of such a thing." "But where are you going?" "To Frankfurt," said Deet. "I have an extra good place there. The family was down at the baths last summer. I had charge of their rooms, and they wanted then to take me back with them. I couldn't manage it, but they are here again this year, and still want me to go with them. And I am going, you may be sure of that." I'm glad I'm not in the child's place, cried Barbel with a shrug of the shoulders. Nobody knows what ails the old man up there. He will have nothing to do with a living soul. From one end of the year to the other, he never sets foot in a church, and if once in a 12-month he comes down with his thick staff, everyone keeps out of his way and is afraid of him. With his heavy gray eyebrows and his tremendous beard, he looks like a heathen and a savage, and people are glad enough to not meet him alone. Nevertheless, said Dietz stubbornly, he's her grandfather, and it's his business to look after the child. He won't do her any harm. If he does, he will have to answer for it, not I. I should like to know, said Barbel inquisitively. I should really like to know what the old man has on his conscience that makes him look so fierce and live all alone up there on the Alm and keep almost hidden from sight. People tell all sorts of stories about him. Of course, you must know something about it, Diet. Your sister must have told you, hasn't she? Of course she has, but I hold my tongue. If he should hear of it, I should suffer. But Barbel had long desired to know the real cause of the Alm uncle's strange behavior, and why it was that he looked so gloomy and lived by himself on the mountain, and why people always spoke of him in a low voice, as if they were afraid to be against him, and yet would not say anything in his favor. Barbel was also ignorant of the reason that all the people in the village called him the Alm uncle, for of course he could not be the actual uncle of all the inhabitants. But as everyone called him so, she did the same, and never spoke of the old man as anything else than Ohi, which in the speech of that region means uncle. Barbel had only recently married into the village. Before that, her home had been down in the valley in Prattigau, and she was not familiar with all the happenings and all the curious characters of the village and the surrounding region through a long series of years. Her good friend Diet, on the other hand, was a native of the village and had lived there till within a year. Then her mother had died, and she had gone down to Ragaz, where the baths are, and had found a fine position as a chambermaid in a great hotel. She had come from Ragaz that very morning with the little girl, having had the chance to ride as far as Mayenfeld on a hay wagon that an acquaintance of hers was driving home. Barbel thought this was a good chance to find out something, and she was bound not to let it slip. She seized Dietz's arm familiarly and said, "But one can learn the real truth from you, instead of the gossip that is talked. I am sure you know the whole story. Come now, just tell me, what is the matter with the old man? Has he always been so feared? Has he always been such a hermit?" "I can't tell whether he has always been so or not. I am 26 now, and he is certainly 70. And of course, I never saw him when he was young. You might know that. If I were certain that he would never again be seen in Prattigau, I might tell you all sorts of things about him. My mother was from Domschlag, and so was he." "There now, Diet, what do you mean?" exclaimed Barbel, a little offended. "You need not be so severe on our gossip in Prattigau. And besides, I can keep a secret or two if need be. Now tell me, you shan't regret it." "Well, then I will, but mind you hold your tongue," said Diet warningly. Before she began, she glanced around to see if the little girl was so close at their heels as to hear every word that was said. The child was not to be seen. She must have ceased following them some distance back, but in their lively conversation, there were several turns in the footpath. But in their lively conversation, they had not noticed it. Diet stood still and gazed all around. There were several turns in the footpath. Nevertheless, they could see almost all the way down to the village. Not a soul was in sight. "I see her," exclaimed Barbel. "There she is. Don't you see her?" And she pointed with her finger to a place quite distant from the path. "She's climbing up the cliffs with the goatherd Peter and his goats. Why is he so late today with his animals? But it is just as well, for he can look after the child, and you will be all the better able to talk with me." "Peter needn't trouble himself to look after her," remarked Diet. "She is not dull for a child of 5 years. She keeps her eyes open and sees what is going on. I've already noticed that, and it's a good thing for her that she does. The old man has nothing to leave her but his 2 goats and his mountain hut." "And did he once have more?" asked Barbel. "He? Well, I should say that he did once have more," replied Deet warmly. "He used to have the finest farm in Domleshk. He was the eldest son and had only one brother, who was quiet and well behaved. But the elder would do nothing but play the fine gentleman and travel about the country, mixing with bad people that nobody knew about. He drank and gambled away the whole property. And so it happened that his father and mother died, one first and then the other, from sheer grief. And his brother, who was also reduced to beggary, went away out of humiliation, nobody knew where. And the uncle himself, as he had nothing left but a bad name, also disappeared. At first no one knew whither. Then it was reported that he had gone with the soldiers to Naples, and after that nothing more was heard of him for 12 or 15 years. Then suddenly he appeared again in Domleshk, with a half-grown boy, and tried to find a home for him among his relations. But every door was closed to him, and no one wanted to know anything more about him. This made him very bitter. He said he would never set foot in Domleshk again, and he came here to Dorfli and lived with the boy. His wife was probably a Grisson woman whom he had come across down below and lost soon after their marriage. He must have had some money still, for he let the boy Tobias learn the carpenter's trade, and he was a steady fellow and well thought of by all the people in Dorfli. But nobody had confidence in the old man, and it was said that he had deserted from Naples, that he had got into trouble, that he had killed somebody, not in war, of course, but in some quarrel. But we recognized the relationship, for my mother's grandmother was his grandmother's first cousin, so we call him Uncle. And as we are related to almost all the people in Dorfli on father's side, they all call him Uncle, and since he went up on the Alm, he has been known as the Alm Uncle. "But what became of Tobias?" asked Barbel eagerly. "Wait, and I'll tell you. I can't tell everything in one breath," exclaimed Deet. "Tobias was serving his time in Mells, and as soon as he finished, he came home to Dorfli and married my sister Adelheid, for they had always been fond of each other, and after their marriage they lived happily together. But it didn't last long. 2 years after, while Tobias was working on a new house, a beam fell on him and killed him. Adelheid's fright and grief when her husband was brought home so disfigured threw her into a violent fever, from which she did not recover. She never was very strong, and was often in such a condition that it was almost impossible to tell whether she was asleep or awake. Only 2 weeks after Tobias's death, Adelheid too was buried. Then the sad fate of the two was in everybody's mouth far and wide, and it was hinted and openly declared that it was a judgment the uncle deserved for his wicked life. It was said so to his face. Even the pastor warned him seriously to repent, but he only grew more and more cross and hard, and no longer spoke to anyone, and everyone avoided him. Suddenly it was reported that the uncle had gone up on the Alm, and no longer came down at all. Since then he has stayed there and lives apart from God and man. Mother and I took Adelheid's little child. She was a year old. Last summer Mother died, and as I wanted to work down at the baths, I took Heidi to board with old Ursel up in, Pfaffersdorf. I was able to stay at the baths all winter. I found plenty of work because I could sew and mend, and early in the spring the lady I served last year came back from Frankfurt, and she's going to take me home with her. Day after tomorrow morning we start. It is a good place, I can tell you. And now, are you going to give the child to the old man up there? I'm surprised that you should think of such a thing, Deet, said Barbel reproachfully. What do you mean? Reported Deet. I have done nothing. I have done my duty by the child. What else could I do with her now? I don't think I could take a child scarcely 5 years old to Frankfurt. But where are you going anyway, Barbel? We are halfway up the Alm now. I have already reached the place where I was going. I want to speak to old goatherd Peter's wife. She does spinning for me in winter. So goodbye, Deet. Good luck to you. Deet shook her companion's hand and stood while Barbel went into the little dark brown mountain hut, standing a few steps from the path in a hollow, where it was somewhat sheltered from the winds. It was a good thing that it was in a little hollow, for it looked so tumble down and decayed that it would have been a dangerous dwelling when the mighty storm wind swept across the mountain, making everything in the hut, doors and windows, rattle, and all the worm-eaten rafters tremble and creak. On such days, if the hut had been up on the elm, it would certainly have been blown down into the valley. Here dwelt the young goatherd Peter, the 11-year-old boy, who every morning went down to Dorfley to get the goats and drive them up on the elm to feed till evening on the short, nourishing herbs. Then Peter would hurry down again with the light-footed animals, give a shrill whistle through his fingers as soon as he reached Dorfley, and all the owners would immediately come and get their goats. Little boys and girls came for the most part, for the creatures were peaceful and harmless. All through the summer, this was the only time in the day when Peter associated with his fellow beings. The rest of the time he lived alone with his goats. To be sure, he had his mother and blind grandmother at home, but he had to go away very early in the morning and come back from Dorfley late in the evening. So in order to play with the children as long as possible, he spent only enough time at home to swallow his bread and milk. His father, who had also been called Peter the goatherd, because he had followed the same calling in his earlier days, had met with an accident some years before while cutting down trees. His mother, whose real name was Brigitte, was called by everyone to distinguish her, Goatherd Peter's wife, and the blind grandmother was known by old and young, far and wide, simply by the name of grandmother. Deet waited a full 10 minutes, looking around in every direction for a glimpse of the children with the goats, but as they were nowhere in sight, she climbed a little higher, where she could have a better view of the elm down to the foot. Here she peered first, this way and then that, showing signs of increasing impatience, both in her face and in her movements. Meanwhile, the children were coming along by a roundabout way. Peter knew many spots where there were all sorts of good shrubs and bushes for the goats to nibble, so he frequently wandered from the path with his flock. At first the child in her heavy garb climbed after them with great difficulty, panting with heat and discomfort and straining every nerve. She said not a word, but gazed first at Peter, who jumped about without any difficulty in his bare feet and light trousers, then at the goats with their small, slender legs, climbing still more easily over bushes and stones and steep rocks. Suddenly, the child sat down on the ground, and in great haste pulled off her shoes and stockings. Then she stood up again, took off her thick red scarf, unfastened her Sunday frock, quickly took that off, and began to unhook her everyday dress. This she wore under the other, to save her Aunt Deet the trouble of carrying it. Quick as lightning, that came off the everyday frock, and there the delighted child stood in her light underclothes, stretching her bare arms out of the short sleeves of her underwaist. Then she laid them all in a neat little pile, and by Peter's side, jumped and climbed after the goats as easily as any in the whole company. And my leg is falling asleep. Peter had not noticed what the child was doing while she remained behind, but when she came running after him in this new costume, a grin began to spread over his face, and when he looked back and saw the little pile of clothes lying on the ground, the grin grew still broader, and his mouth reached almost from ear to ear. But he said nothing. The child, feeling so free and light, began to talk with Peter, and he had all sorts of questions to answer, for she wanted to know how many goats he had, where he was going with them, and what he would do when he reached there. Finally, the children with the goats approached the hut and came in sight of Aunt Deet. She had hardly caught a glimpse of the group climbing up the mountainside when she screamed out, "Heidi, what have you been doing? What is the matter with you? Where is your best dress and the other one with your scarf? I bought you brand new shoes on the mountain, and I made you new stockings, and they're all gone. All gone. Heidi, what have you done with them? Where have you put them all?" The child calmly pointed down the mountain and said, "There." The aunt followed the direction of her finger. To be sure, there lay something, and on the top of it was a red speck. That was surely the scarf. "You careless girl," cried the aunt in great excitement. "What were you thinking about? Why did you take everything off? What did you mean?" I didn't need them, said the child, without looking in the least sorry for what she had done. Oh, you careless, senseless Heidi, don't you know anything? The aunt went on, lamenting and scolding. It will take half an hour for anyone to go down there again. Come, Peter, run back for me and get the things. Come, be quick, and don't stand there staring at me as if you were nailed to the ground. I am late already, said Peter slowly, and with both his hands in his pockets, stood still, just where he was when he heard the aunt's angry reproaches. If you stand there staring like that, you will not get far, I'm thinking, called out Aunt Deet. Come here, you must have something nice. Do you see this? She held up a new penny, which glistened before Peter's eyes. Suddenly he started, and with tremendous leaps went the shortest way down the elm, and soon reached the little pile of clothes. He picked them up and brought them back so quickly that the aunt could not help praising him, and gave him his money without delay. Peter put it deep down in his pocket, and his face lit up with a broad grin, for such a treasure did not very often fall to his share. You may carry the things on up to the uncle's, as long as you're going that way, continued Aunt Deet, while she set about climbing the steep cliff that rose high behind Peter's hut. The boy willingly undertook the task, and followed the others with his bundle in his left hand and swinging his stick in his right. Heidi and the goat skipped and jumped along merrily by his side. Thus, in about 3/4 of an hour, the procession reached the height where, on a projecting cliff, stood the old uncle's hut, exposed to every wind, but also open to every ray of sunlight, and with a wide view of the valley below. Behind the hut stood 3 ancient fir trees, with long, thick, untrimmed branches. Farther back, the mountain, with its old gray rocks, rose higher still, now displaying lovely, fertile pastures, now a tangle of great stones and bushes, and finally, above them all, bare, steep cliffs. The uncle had made himself a seat outside the hut on the side that overlooked the valley. Here he sat with his pipe in his mouth, his hands resting on his knees, calmly watching the children, Aunt Deet, and the goats as they came climbing up the mountain. Aunt Deet had been gradually left behind, and Heidi was the first to reach the hut. She went straight to the old man, held out her hand to him, and said, "How do you do, grandfather?" "Well, well, what does this mean?" asked the old man roughly, barely touching the child's hand and giving her a long, searching look from under his bushy eyebrows. Heidi gazed back at him in return, without once winking her eyes, for she had never seen anyone like her grandfather, with his long beard and heavy great eyebrows meeting in the middle of his forehead like a thicket. In the meanwhile, Aunt Deet arrived with Peter, who stood still for a time, looking on to see what would happen. "I wish you good morning, uncle," said Deet, stepping up to him. "I have brought Tobias and Adelheide's child to you. You will hardly know her, for you haven't seen her since she was a year old." "Well, what can the child do here with me?" asked the old man curtly. "And you there," he called out to Peter, "you can go along with your goats. You are none too early. Take mine too." Peter obeyed without delay and disappeared, for the uncle had made it plain that he was not wanted. "She must stay with you, uncle," said Deet in reply to his question. "I am sure I have done my duty by her these 4 years, and now it is your turn to do what you can for her." "Indeed," said the old man, and his eyes flashed at Deet. "Suppose the child begins to fret and whine for you, as is usually the case with the unreasonable little things. What shall I do with her?" "That is your business," retorted Deet. "I am sure no one told me what to do with the little one when it was given into my hands, only a year old, and I already had enough to do to take care of myself and mother. Now I must look out for myself, and you are the next of kin to the child. If you can't have her, do what you please with her. You will have to answer for her if she comes to any harm. You don't want to have anything more laid to your charge." Deet's conscience was not quite easy. She became excited and said more than she had intended. The uncle rose at her last words. He gave her such a look that she took several steps backward. Then he stretched out his arm and said sternly, "Get you gone down where you came from, and don't show yourself here again very soon." Deet did not need to be told twice. "Goodbye, then, and goodbye to you too, Heidi," she said quickly. and hurried down the mountain to Dorfley as fast as she could go, for her great agitation forced her onward, as if she were a powerful steam engine. In Dorfley, many more asked her about Heidi. They all knew Deet well and whose child Heidi was, and all that had taken place. When from every door and window came the question, "Where's the child, Deet? Where have you left the child?" she called back, with more and more irritation. "Up with the alm, uncle, up with the alm, uncle, I tell you." She was disgusted, because the women everywhere exclaimed, "How could you do so?" and "The poor little soul!" and "Such a little helpless thing left up there." And then again and again, "The poor little soul." Deet pushed on as fast as she could, and was glad when she was out of their hearing. She did not feel quite easy about the matter, for the dying mother had given the child to her. But she quieted her misgivings by saying to herself that it would not be long before she could do something again for the child, since she would be earning a good deal of money. So she felt very glad that she would soon be in a fine situation and far away from all the people who would speak to her about the matter. Chapter 2. At the grandfather's. After Deet had disappeared, the uncle sat down again on the bench and blew great clouds of smoke from his pipe, while he kept his eyes fixed on the ground without saying a word. Meanwhile, Heidi was content to look about her. She discovered the goat's shed, built near the hut, and peeped into it. It was empty. The child continued hunting about and came to the fir trees behind the hut. The wind was blowing hard, and it whistled and roared through the branches, high up in the tops. Heidi stood still and listened. When it stopped somewhat, she went around to the other side of the hut and came back to her grandfather. When she found him in the same place where she had left him, she placed herself in front of him, put her hands behind her, and gazed at him. Her grandfather looked up. "What do you want to do?" he asked, as the child continued standing in front of him without moving. "I want to see what you have in the hut," said Heidi. "Come along, then." And the grandfather rose and started to go into the hut. "Bring your bundle of clothes," he said as he entered. "I shan't want them any more," replied Heidi. The old man turned around and looked sharply at the child, whose black eyes shone in expectation of what might be inside the hut. "She's not lacking in brains," he said half to himself. "Why don't you need them any more?" he asked aloud. "I'd rather go like the goats with their swift little legs." "So you shall, but bring the things along," commanded the grandfather. "They can be put into the cupboard." Heidi obeyed. The old man opened the door, and Heidi followed him into a good-sized room, which occupied the whole hut. In it were a table and a chair. In one corner was the grandfather's bed, in another the fireplace, where hung the large kettle. On the other side, in the wall, was a large door, which the grandfather opened. It was the cupboard. There hung his clothes, and on one shelf lay his shirts, stockings, and linen. On another were plates, cups, and glasses, and on the topmost a loaf of bread, smoked meat, and cheese. Everything the alm uncle owned and needed for his living was kept in this closet. As soon as he had opened the door, Heidi came running with her bundle and pushed it in, as far back of her grandfather's clothes as possible, that it might not be easy to find again. Then she looked carefully around the room and said, "Where shall I sleep, grandfather?" "Wherever you like," he replied. This was quite to Heidi's mind. She looked into every nook and corner to see where would be the best place for her to sleep. In the corner by her grandfather's bed stood a little ladder, which led to the hayloft. Heidi climbed this. There lay a fresh, fragrant heap of hay, and through a round window one could look far down into the valley below. "This is where I will sleep," Heidi called down. "It is lovely." "Just come and see how lovely it is up here, grandfather." "I know all about it," sounded from below. "I am going to make a bed," called out the child again, as she ran busily to and fro in the loft. "But you must come up here and bring a sheet, for the bed must have a sheet for me to sleep on." "Well, well," said the grandfather below, and after a few moments he went to the cupboard and rummaged about. Then he drew out from under his shirts a long, coarse piece of cloth which might serve for a sheet. He came up the ladder and found that a very neat little bed had been made in the hayloft. The hay was piled up higher at one end to form the pillow, and the bed was placed in such a way that one could look from it straight out through the round open window. "That was made very nicely," said the grandfather. "Next comes the sheet. But wait a moment." And he took up a good armful of hay and made the bed as thick again, in order that the hard floor might not be felt through it. "There, now put it on." Heidi quickly took hold of the sheet, but was unable to lift it. It was so heavy. However, this made it all the better because the sharp wisps of hay could not push through the firm cloth. Then the two together spread the sheet over the hay, and where it was too broad or too long, Heidi quickly tucked it under. Now it appeared quite trim and neat, and Heidi stood looking at it thoughtfully. "We have forgotten one thing, grandfather," she said. "What is that?" he asked. "The coverlet. When we go to bed, we creep in between the sheet and the coverlet." "Is that so? But supposing I haven't any?" asked the old man. "Oh, then it's no matter," said Heidi soothingly. "We can take more hay for a coverlet." She was about to run to the haymow again, but her grandfather prevented her. "Wait a moment," he said, and went down the ladder to his own bed. Then he came back and laid a large, heavy linen bag on the floor. "Isn't that better than hay?" he asked. Heidi pulled at the bag with all her might and main, trying to unfold it, but her little hands could not manage the heavy thing. Her grandfather helped, and when it was finally spread out on the bed, it all looked very neat and comfortable. And Heidi, looking at her new resting place admiringly, said, "That is a splendid coverlet, and the whole bed is lovely. How I wish it were night so that I could lie down in it." "I think we might have something to eat first," said the grandfather. "What do you say?" In her eagerness over the bed, Heidi had forgotten everything else. But now that eating was suggested to her, a great feeling of hunger rose within her, for she had taken nothing all day, except a piece of bread and a cup of weak coffee early in the morning, and afterward she had made the long journey. So Heidi heartily agreed, saying, "Yes, I think so too." "Well, let us go down, since we are agreed," said the old man, and followed close upon the child's steps. He went to the fireplace, pushed the large kettle aside, and drew forward the little one that hung on the chain, sat down on the three-legged wooden stool with the round seat, and kindled a bright fire. Almost immediately the kettle began to boil, and the old man held over the fire a large piece of cheese on the end of a long iron fork. He moved it this way and that until it was golden yellow on all sides. Heidi looked on with eager attention. Suddenly a new idea came to her mind. She jumped up and ran to the cupboard and kept going back and forth. When the grandfather brought the toasted cheese to the table, it was already nicely laid with the round loaf of bread, 2 plates, and 2 knives, for Heidi had noticed everything in the cupboard and knew that all would be needed for the meal. "That is right to think of doing something yourself," said the grandfather, laying the cheese on the bread and putting the teapot on the table. "But there is something still lacking." Heidi saw how invitingly the steam came out of the pot and ran quickly back to the cupboard. But there was only one little bowl there. Heidi was not long puzzled. Behind it stood 2 glasses. The child immediately came back with the bowl and glasses and placed them on the table. "Very good. You know how to help yourself. But where are you going to sit?" The grandfather himself was sitting in the only chair. Heidi shot like an arrow to the fireplace, brought back the little three-legged stool, and sat down on it. "Well, you have a seat, sure enough, only it is rather low," said the grandfather. "But in my chair also you would be too short to reach the table. Still, you must have something anyway, so come." Saying which, he rose, filled the little bowl with milk, placed it on the chair, and pushed it close to the three-legged stool, so that Heidi had a table in front of her. The grandfather laid a large slice of bread and a piece of the golden cheese on the chair and said, "Eat." He seated himself on the corner of the table and began his dinner. Heidi grasped her bowl and drank without stopping, for all the thirst of her long journey came back to her. Then she drew a long breath and set down the bowl. "Do you like the milk?" asked the grandfather. "I've never tasted such good milk before," answered Heidi. "Then you must have some more." And the grandfather filled the bowl again to the rim and placed it before the child, who looked quite content as she began to eat her bread, after it had been spread with the toasted cheese, soft as butter. The combination tasted very good, with frequent drinks of milk. When the meal was over, the grandfather went out to the goat shed to put it in order, and Heidi watched him closely as he first swept it clean with a broom and then laid down fresh straw for the animals to sleep on. Then he went to his little shop, cut some round sticks, shaped a board, made some holes in it, put the round sticks into them, and suddenly it was a stool like his own, only much higher. Heidi was speechless with amazement as she saw his work. "What is this, Heidi?" asked the grandfather. "It is a stool for me, because it is so high. You made it all at once," said the child, still deeply astonished. "She knows what she sees. Her eyes are in the right place," remarked the grandfather to himself as he went around the hut, driving a nail here and there. Then he repaired something about the door and went from place to place with hammer, nails, and pieces of wood, mending and clearing away wherever it was needed. Heidi followed him step by step and watched him with the closest attention, and everything he did interested her very much. Evening was coming on. It was beginning to blow harder in the old fir trees, for a mighty wind had sprung up and was whistling and moaning through their thick tops. It sounded so beautiful in Heidi's ears and heart that she was quite delighted, and skipped and jumped under the firs as if she were feeling the greatest pleasure of her life. The grandfather stood in the doorway and watched the child. A shrill whistle sounded. Heidi stopped her jumping, and the grandfather stepped outside. Down from above came goat after goat, leaping like a hunting train, and Peter in the midst of them. With a shout of joy, Heidi rushed in among the flock and greeted her old friends of the morning, one after the other. When they reached the hut, they all stood still, and two lovely slender goats, one white, the other brown, came out from the others to the grandfather and licked his hands, in which he held some salt to welcome them. This he did each evening. Peter disappeared with his flock. Heidi gently stroked first one goat and then the other, and ran around to stroke them on the other side. She was perfectly delighted with the little creatures. "Are they ours, grandfather? Are they both ours? Will they go into the shed? Will they stay with us always?" asked Heidi, one question following the other in her delight. When the goats had finished licking their salt, the old man said, "Go and bring out your little bowl and the bread." Heidi obeyed and came back at once. Grandfather milked the goat and filled the bowl and cut off a piece of bread, saying, "Now eat your supper and then go up to bed. Your Aunt Deet left a bundle for you. Your nightgowns and other things are in it. You will find it downstairs in the closet if you need it. I must attend to the goats now, so sleep well." "Good night, grandfather, good night." "What are their names, grandfather? What are their names?" cried the child, running after the old man and the goats as they disappeared into the shed. "The white one is named Schwanley, which means little swan, and the brown one is the brown one Barley, which means little bear," answered the grandfather. "Good night, Schwanley, good night, Barley," called Heidi at the top of her voice. Then Heidi sat down on the bench and ate her bread and drank her milk. But the strong wind almost blew her off her seat, so she finished hastily, then went in and climbed up to her bed, in which she immediately fell asleep, and slept as soundly and well as if she had been in the loveliest bed of some royal princess. Not long after, even before it was entirely dark, the grandfather also went to bed, for he was always up with the sun, and it came climbing over the mountain very early in the summertime. In the night the wind blew with such force that its blast made the whole hut tremble, and every rafter creaked. It howled and groaned down the chimney like voices in distress, and outside in the fir trees it raged with such fury that now and then a bough was broken off. In the middle of the night the grandfather rose and said half aloud to himself, "She may be afraid." He climbed the ladder and went to Heidi's bedside. The moon outside shone brightly in the sky for a moment, and then disappeared behind the driving clouds, and everything grew dark. Then the moonlight came again, brightly through the round opening, and fell directly on Heidi's couch. Her cheeks were fiery red as she slept under the heavy coverlet, and she lay perfectly calm and peaceful on her little round arm. She must have been dreaming happy dreams, for a look of happiness was on her face. The grandfather gazed long at the sweetly sleeping child until the moon went behind a cloud again and it was dark. Then he went back to his own bed. That is the end of chapter 2 of Heidi by Joanna Spyri. I hope you enjoyed our story time this evening. Bob, I think we had a very good change of scenery, and we will see you all again soon. Thank you.